Imagine walking into a restaurant, thinking you're in charge, only to find out the man you just insulted isn't just another customer. He's the actual owner, and not just any owner, but Big Shaq himself. What happened next shocked the entire place and left everyone with a lesson they'll never forget. Welcome back to BrainFuel, the channel where real-life stories meet powerful lessons that inspire, entertain, and open your mind. If you love stories that keep you hooked from start to finish while teaching something meaningful, you're in the right place. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let's dive right into today's story. Get out of here. You don't belong in a place like this. Those words didn't just sting. They cut to the soft hum of jazz music floating across the restaurant and silenced conversations at nearby tables. People froze, forks halfway to their mouths, as they turned to look at the young waiter standing stiffly, his arms crossed and his chin lifted in pride. And right there, sitting at the table with a calm, unreadable expression, was none other than Shaquille O'Neal, Big Shaq, not dressed in a flashy suit or covered in designer labels. No, tonight Shaq had chosen something simple: dark jeans, a loose hoodie, and sneakers. To him, it was just dinner. To the waiter, however, it was a chance to flex his arrogance. The irony? The man he had just tried to push out wasn't just a customer. He was a hidden owner of the very restaurant the waiter worked in. But the waiter didn't know that. Shaq had walked in quietly that evening, ducking his head to avoid being recognized too quickly. He wasn't in the mood for flashing cameras or autograph requests. All he wanted was a good meal in one of his own establishments. But he had barely taken 3 steps inside before the waiter intercepted him, like a guard dog protecting forbidden territory. "Excuse me, sir," the waiter said sharply, blocking Shaq's path. "This isn't the place for people like you." The words weren't shouted, but they dripped with disdain. The waiter's eyes flicked up and down, judging every detail of Shaq's outfit. In his mind, expensive restaurants were meant for people in suits, shiny shoes, and luxury watches. Jeans and a hoodie? That didn't scream wealthy guess him. It screamed wrong crowd. Shaq raised an eyebrow. At 7 feet tall, he towered over the young man, but he didn't move aggressively. He simply tilted his head, studying the waiter the way a teacher might study a foolish student. "And what kind of people belong here?" Shaq asked calmly, his deep voice commanding attention without effort. The waiter didn't even flinch. He had no clue who he was speaking to. High-class clients. People who can afford this kind of dining experience. Not whatever you are. Gasps rippled across the dining room. Some guests recognized Shaq immediately. His face, his height, his unmistakable presence. He was exactly someone you could overlook. Phones started sliding out of pockets. Some tried to record without being too obvious. Others just stared, wide-eyed, wondering how far this audacious waiter was willing to go. But Shaq didn't lash out. He didn't slam his fist on the table or raise his voice. Instead, he smiled faintly and pulled out a chair. "I think I'll stay," he said, settling his massive frame into the seat. The waiter blinked, then scoffed. "Suit yourself. But don't expect a menu unless you can pay for it front." That was the final straw for the surrounding diners. Whispers turned into murmurs. "Does he not know who that is?" One woman whispered to her friend. "That's Shaquille O'Neal." But the waiter's arrogance blinded him. All he saw was a casually dressed man, and in his narrow vision, that meant unworthy. What made the situation even more bizarre was the contrast between Shaq's composure and the waiter's pride. Shaq sat comfortably, his large hands folded on the table, his expression steady. The waiter, meanwhile, puffed his chest out like a rooster, convinced he had done his job perfectly. He leaned down and sneered, "Sir, I'll be honest with you. Meals here aren't cheap. They're for people with taste, people with status, not someone who looks like they wandered in off the street." This time, Shaq chuckled, a deep, rumbling laugh that rolled across the room like distant thunder. He wasn't laughing at the insult itself. He'd heard worse in his life. He was laughing at the ignorance, the sheer boldness of this waiter, who had no idea he was trying to belittle the very man who signed his paychecks. "Interesting," Shaq murmured, his eyes glinting with amusement. "So tell me, how do you decide who has taste and who doesn't? Is it the clothes? The shoes? The watch?" The waiter smirked. "Exactly. Class shows itself. It's obvious. Oh, it's obvious. All right, Shaq replied softly, his voice carrying a weight that made even the nearby tables lean in closer. The tension was thick now. Guests were holding their breath, waiting for the explosion. Surely, they thought, Shaq would reveal himself any second, unleash his identity, and put the arrogant waiter in his place. But instead, he played along, giving the young man more rope to hang himself with. The manager hadn't yet appeared, and the staff at other tables watched nervously, unsure of whether to intervene. The room felt suspended in time, half in shock, half in anticipation. The waiter, oblivious to the storm he was brewing, leaned closer. Look, I don't want to embarrass you, but this restaurant is reserved for a certain type of customer. People who can actually pay for a bottle of wine that costs more than your whole outfit. Another round of gasps. Some guests shook their heads in disgust. Others whispered furiously. By now, at least 5 phones were recording openly, lenses pointed straight at the unfolding drama. But still, Shaq didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand up. He didn't even argue. Instead, he just nodded slowly, as if every insult was another piece of evidence he was storing away for later. Inside, though, he was already forming the lesson he was going to teach, not just to this waiter, but to everyone watching, because this moment wasn't just about disrespect. It was about something bigger, something deeper. It was about judgment, about arrogance, about the danger of deciding someone's worth based on what they wear, instead of who they are. And Shaq knew that the lesson he was about to deliver would echo far beyond the walls of this restaurant. The tension inside the restaurant grew heavier with every passing second. Conversations that had once been filled with laughter and clinking glasses had now been replaced with whispers, gasps, and the soft hum of curiosity. The young waiter, still standing tall with his arms folded, seemed completely unaware of the storm he was creating. His voice carried an arrogance that echoed to the elegant dining hall, bouncing off the chandeliers and polished floors. "Sir, this isn't the kind of place for someone like you," he repeated, almost louder this time, as if he wanted the entire restaurant to hear his judgment. And the truth was, they were listening. Every single person in that room had turned their attention toward the scene unfolding between the towering man in the hoodie and the waiter with too much pride. Some of the guests, the ones who were real basketball fans, already knew who they were looking at. Their eyes widened, and some even mouthed his name to each other in disbelief. Shaquille O'Neal wasn't just some random guest who had wandered in. He was a global icon, a man whose face was recognized everywhere, from NBA courts to TV commercials. To them, the waiter's behavior was beyond shocking. It was career suicide in slow motion. One guest, a woman seated near the window, leaned into her husband and whispered, "That's Shaq." "Oh my God, that's actually Shaq. Does that waiter not recognize him?" Her husband shook his head, whispering back, "He must not. No one in their right mind would talk to him like that." At another table, a group of college kids who had been celebrating a birthday began pulling out their phones, not even pretending to hide them anymore. They knew this was going to be viral material, the kind of once-in-a-lifetime moment you couldn't script even if you tried. The whispers grew louder, buzzing like bees around the room. But through it all, Shaq sat quietly, his massive frame relaxed, his face calm. He didn't need to raise his voice to command attention. His silence was powerful enough. The waiter, however, mistook that silence for weakness. Believing he had the upper hand, he leaned forward, his smirk growing wider. "Look, I'm just trying to save you from embarrassment," he said, his tone dripping with superiority. "Meals here cost more than some people make in a week. The menu isn't free, and if you can't afford it, there's a fast food place right down the street." That line hit the room like a slap. Several guests gasped loudly this time. A man in a suit muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable the nerve of this kid." One brave diner, a middle-aged woman sitting a few tables away, actually called out, "Do you know who you're talking to?" Her voice cracked with disbelief, but the waiter ignored her, brushing it off like background noise. Shaq, on the other hand, didn't ignore it. He turned his head slowly toward the woman, gave her a small smile, and then looked back at the waiter. "I'll take the menu," he said calmly, his voice steady but deep enough to make everyone fall silent again. The waiter chuckled, shaking his head. The menu isn't free. Like I said, you need to show that you can pay first. This was no longer just arrogance. It was pure disrespect, and everyone in the room could feel the weight of it. People exchanged looks, torn between stepping in and staying out of it. Some couldn't believe the waiter still hadn't realized who he was speaking to. Others wondered if Shaq would finally snap, rise to his full 7-foot height, and put the young man in his place with one booming sentence. But that wasn't Shaq's way. Instead of anger, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. His voice was calm, almost playful. "You must really think you figured me out," he said, his tone carrying a hint of amusement. "All based on some clothes." The waiter smirked again, still not backing down. "It's obvious," he said proudly. "People who belong here don't dress like that. They don't walk in without reservations. They carry themselves differently. You can spot class when you see it." Shaq chuckled, shaking his head slowly. His laugh wasn't loud, but it was enough to ripple through the dining room. "Class, huh?" he repeated. "You sure about that?" "Yes," the waiter replied firmly, standing his ground. By now, the audience wasn't just watching. They were invested. It felt like a live performance, a play where everyone knew the twist ending except for the actor delivering the wrong lines. Guests leaned forward in their chairs, barely blinking, afraid they might miss the exact second the truth came crashing down on the waiter's head. The tension grew thicker. A couple near the back whispered to each other, "Why isn't he saying who he is? Why doesn't Shaq just tell him?" The wife shook her head. "Because he's teaching him something. Look at him. He's letting this kid dig his own grave." And that's exactly what was happening. What made it even more electrifying was how different Shaq's approach was compared to what people expected. Most would have erupted by now, pulled out proof of ownership, dropped their name like a hammer, and demanded the waiter be fired on the spot. But not Shaq. He was patient, strategic, almost enjoying the irony. He knew the entire restaurant was now a witness, and he understood the power of letting the scene play out. It wasn't just about humiliating one arrogant waiter. It was about showing everyone, right then and there, what respect really looked like. As the waiter straightened up, looking around smugly as if he'd won some kind of battle, more phones tilted upward. Social media was about to explode with this story. Clips would be uploaded, comments would pour in, and people all over the world would shake their heads at the young man's ignorance. And Shaq, he would still be calm, still collected, waiting for the perfect moment to flip the entire situation on its head. Because one thing was clear, this wasn't just a dinner anymore. This was about to become a lesson to the waiter, and everyone watching would never forget. The tension inside the restaurant had reached a breaking point. The air felt heavy, as though the walls themselves were leaning in to witness what would happen next. Guests whispered furiously among themselves, some shaking their heads at the waiter's boldness, others hiding behind their menus while secretly filming on their phones. But then everything shifted. The manager finally appeared. He came rushing from the back, adjusting his tie, completely unaware of the scene he was about to step into. He had been handling paperwork in the office and hadn't noticed the whispers spreading like wildfire across the dining room. But the moment his eyes landed on the tall figure seated calmly at the table, his heart nearly leapt out of his chest. "Mr. O'Neill!" he gasped, his voice cracking as though he'd just seen a ghost. The sound of that name echoed through the restaurant like thunder. Conversations halted instantly. Every whisper fell silent. Every guest's head snapped toward the manager, then back to man sitting quietly with a faint smile. Shaq. There it was. The truth spilled into the open. The towering man in the hoodie, the one the waiter had dismissed and mocked, wasn't just another customer. He wasn't someone who didn't belong. He was Shaquille O'Neal, NBA legend, global icon, and most importantly, the silent owner of the very restaurant where the waiter worked. The waiter's face drained to color. His smirk collapsed like a crumbling wall, replaced by wide eyes and a jaw that hung uselessly. His legs trembled as the realization slammed into him like a freight train. He hadn't just insulted a customer. He had insulted the boss. The entire restaurant could feel the shift in power. Just a moment ago, the waiter had puffed his chest, playing the role of gatekeeper, acting as if he owned the place. Now, in a blink, the truth stripped him of his pride, leaving him exposed in front of the very crowd he thought he was impressing. The manager hurried forward, nearly tripping over himself as he reached the table. His voice wavered, desperate to fix the disaster. "Mr. O'Neill, I had no idea you were visiting tonight. Please, accept my deepest apologies. This should never have happened." Shaq raised his hand slowly, his calm presence commanding silence once again. His deep voice rumbled, low but powerful. "No, don't apologize for him. Let him speak." The crowd gasped again. The waiter's knees buckled slightly. He wished the floor would swallow him whole. But Shaq's eyes were locked onto him, patient but piercing, like a spotlight that left nowhere to hide. "Go ahead," Shaq continued, leaning forward slightly. "Tell me again, why don't I belong here?" The waiter's lips trembled. His earlier confidence had evaporated. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his voice catching his throat as the entire restaurant leaned in, waiting. I didn't know," he stuttered, his words barely a whisper. "That's not what you said earlier," Shaq countered, his voice firm but calm. "Earlier, you said this restaurant was for high-class clients. That people like me didn't belong. Isn't that what you said?" The waiter's face turned crimson. He opened his mouth, searching for an excuse, but no words came. He had dug the hole himself, and now he was sinking into it. Shaq leaned back, his massive frame filling the chair, his voice echoing across the room. "I own this restaurant. Every detail you see around you, these tables, these lights, that piano in the corner, I paid for it. Not so people could come here and feel judged. Not so my staff would decide who looks worthy and who doesn't." Murmurs spread to the crowd again, but this time they weren't whispers of shock. They were murmurs of respect. Guests nodded. Some even applauded softly, their eyes fixed on Shaq's towering figure. The manager looked like he was about to faint, wringing his hands nervously. "Please, Mr. O'Neill, let me handle this." But Shaq shook his head. "No, this is my restaurant. And if this is how my customers are treated when I'm not around, then I need to know. Because the food can be perfect, the decor can be beautiful, but if respect isn't served, none of it matters." The room broke into scattered applause. The guests weren't just entertained anymore, they were moved. Shaq's words carried weight, echoing far beyond the insult that had started it all. The waiter, now visibly shaking, tried to speak. "I didn't mean it, sir. I thought—" His words fell apart before he could finish. "You thought my clothes told you everything about me," Shaq finished for him. "You thought appearance equals worth. But let me tell you something. Respect is free. It costs nothing to treat someone kindly. Whether they walk in wearing a suit or sweatpants, whether they drive a Bentley or walk here on foot, you treat them the same." The restaurant erupted in applause again, louder this time. Some guests even stood, clapping with admiration. The waiter's eyes dropped to the floor, his face hot with humiliation, but the lesson was already branded into his memory. What made the moment so powerful wasn't just Shaq's identity reveal. It was the way he handled it. He didn't scream. He didn't threaten. He didn't use his fame to belittle the waiter. Instead, he flipped the entire situation into a teaching moment, not just for the waiter, but for everyone watching. Shaq pointed at the waiter, his voice softening slightly. "You work here to serve people. But tonight, you forgot that. Instead of welcoming me, you tried to push me away. But let me tell you, if you can't respect people, you don't belong here." The waiter's eyes welled with tears, his pride shattered. The manager looked helpless, unsure whether to fire him on the spot or beg for mercy on his behalf. But Shaq wasn't finished. He stood up, towering over everyone in the room. His presence alone was commanding, but his words carried even more power. This isn't just about one waiter. The restaurant had gone from whispers to thunderous applause in a matter of minutes. The guests had witnessed the kind of scene you only see in movies, a man being humiliated by his own arrogance, and the unexpected reveal of the true owner. Yet the story wasn't finished. Shaq hadn't stood up to fire the waiter on the spot, even though the man clearly deserved it. He hadn't lashed out, even though the insults had been cutting and cruel. Instead, he was about to do something far more powerful, Deliver a lesson that would echo long after that night was over. The waiter, head lowered in shame, stood trembling at Shaq's side. The manager hovered nervously nearby, his face pale as chalk, terrified that the incident might ruin the restaurant's reputation. Guests leaned forward in their seats, their eyes locked on the towering man in the hoodie, waiting to see what he would say next. Shaq placed both hands on the table, his deep voice cutting through the silence. "I want everyone here to hear this," he began, "because this isn't just about one waiter. It's about something bigger. Respect." The room fell still again. Forks were set down, glasses left untouched, as every ear tuned in. Shaq's presence demanded it. He turned his gaze to the waiter, who still couldn't lift his eyes. "You thought that because I wasn't dressed like you expected, I didn't belong. You thought clothes or shoes, or a watch decide who's worthy of eating here. But that's not class, that's arrogance." Gasps rippled through the room again, but this time they were directed at the truth of his words. Shaq wasn't just speaking to the waiter. He was speaking to everyone. "I own this restaurant," Shaq continued, his voice steady, his tone commanding. "And when I built it, I wanted it to be a place where anyone could walk through those doors and feel welcome. Doesn't matter if they're wearing a $1,000 suit or the same jeans they've had for 5 years. Everyone deserves respect. Everyone deserves kindness, because respect is free. It doesn't cost you a thing to give it." The audience broke into soft applause, nodding and murmuring in agreement. Some looked around the room with guilt in their eyes, realizing they too had judged others unfairly at times. Shaq wasn't done. He rose from his chair, his 7-foot frame towering over the waiter, over the tables, over the entire room. The effect was overwhelming. It was as if a giant had risen, not to strike down, but to lift up a truth that couldn't be ignored. "You embarrass yourself tonight," Shaq said firmly, looking directly at the waiter. "You embarrass this restaurant, and you embarrass the people who work hard every day to make this place what it is. And you did it because you forgot the most important thing about this job. Your role isn't a judge, it's a serve." The waiter swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill. His voice was a shaky whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" Shaq raised a hand, stopping him. "No, sorry isn't enough. Words are easy. Actions show who you really are." The crowd murmured again, feeling the weight of that statement. Guests exchanged looks, some even nodding with approval. Then, instead of turning to the manager and demanding the waiter's immediate dismissal, Shaq did something nobody expected. He leaned forward, pointing directly at the young man. "You've got 2 choices. You can leave tonight, walk out that door, and never come back. Or—" The waiter lifted his head slightly, hope flickering in his eyes. "You can stay," Shaq continued, his voice strong but fair. "But if you stay, you start over. You wash dishes. You clean tables. You serve every customer with respect, no matter how they look, no matter what they wear. You learn what this job really means. And only when you've learned that, really learned it, will you have earned your place here." The room erupted in applause again, this time louder than before. Guests clapped, some even cheering. A few stood on their feet, inspired by the unexpected wisdom of the moment. The waiter's face flushed, but he nodded quickly, choking out the words, "I'll stay. I want to learn." Shaq studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. "Good. Then remember this. Respect first, everything else second. That's how we do things here." The lesson wasn't just for the waiter. The entire room felt it. People looked at one another differently, with softer eyes, realizing how often they themselves might have made judgments based on appearances. Some of them felt guilty, remembering times when they had dismissed someone because of clothes, status, or background. One man whispered to his wife, "You know, I almost thought the same thing when he walked in. I didn't recognize him at first either." Makes you think, doesn't it? His wife nodded quietly, her hand resting on his. "It does. Respect is free." Those words, "respect is free," echoed like a mantra across the room. Shaq sat back down, calm once more, as if the storm had passed. But the ripple he created that night was far from over. The story would spread, first through the guests who had been there, then through the phones that had captured every second. Before long, millions would see the video, share it, and talk about it. Not because of the humiliation, not because of the drama, but because of the lesson. Shaq had shown that true strength isn't about putting someone down. It's about lifting everyone up with a reminder that could change lives. Respect. It costs nothing, but it means everything. And for the waiter, that night became the turning point of his life. The shame he felt burned deep, but so did the lesson. He would scrub tables, wash dishes, and slowly rebuild himself. Not just as a waiter, but as a person who finally understood the value of humility. Because that night wasn't about money, status, or fame. It was about a man who could have crushed his critic with a single word, but instead chose to teach him, and everyone watching, the greatest truth of all. Respect is the foundation of class. Without it, nothing else matters. The restaurant slowly returned to its rhythm that night, but the energy wasn't the same. Guests weren't just eating anymore. They were talking, reflecting, and sharing what they had just witnessed. That one moment, that one clash between arrogance and humility, had transformed an ordinary evening into something unforgettable. But for the waiter, the night was far from over. He stayed behind after closing, scrubbing tables and sweeping floors, his mind replaying Shaq's words again and again. Respect is free. It costs nothing to be kind. Those words carved themselves deep into his memory, louder than any applause, heavier than any humiliation. For the first time, he realized how shallow he had been. His idea of class had been about clothes, watches, and wallets. He thought success was obvious, that you could see in the shine of someone's shoes or the cut of their suit. But that night shattered his illusion, because the man he had mocked, the one he thought didn't belong, turned out to be the very person who had built the dream he was standing in. And yet, instead of destroying him, Shaq gave him a chance to learn, a chance to grow. The following weeks were a test unlike anything the waiter had ever experienced. He traded his arrogant smirk for rubber gloves, his sharp tongue for silence, and his pride for humility. He started at the very bottom, washing dishes in the steamy kitchen, scrubbing floors until they shined, cleaning tables long after the guests had left. At first, he hated it. Every night his back ached and his ego burned. But slowly, something inside him began to shift. He watched how the other staff treated the guests, with patience, with warmth, with genuine smiles. He saw how a kind word could light up someone's entire evening. He noticed how respect made the restaurant more than just a place to eat. It made it a place to belong. And with every passing day, he began to understand what Shaq had meant. Respect wasn't about who had more money. It wasn't about clothes or cars. Respect was about dignity, about recognizing the humanity in every person who walked through those doors. Shaq returned often, though never with a big announcement. He'd slip in quietly, sit at a corner table, and watch. Sometimes he'd order food, sometimes just water, but his presence alone reminded the staff of the lesson he had delivered that night. The waiter always felt his chest tighten when Shaq appeared, but over time, it wasn't fear anymore, it was determination. He wanted to show him that he was changing, that the lesson had sunk in. One evening, months later, the moment finally came. The restaurant was packed, laughter and music filling the air, when Shaq entered once again. This time, the waiter didn't smirk, didn't scoff, didn't block his way. Instead, he rushed to greet him, his voice steady but humble. "Good evening, sir," he said softly. "Welcome back. It's an honor to serve you." Shaq studied him carefully. The arrogance was gone. In its place was humility, genuine, hard-earned humility. The waiter guided him to a table with respect, pulled out the chair, and handed him a menu without hesitation. "We're glad you're here tonight," he added, his eyes sincere. Shaq smiled, a warm, approving smile that made the waiter's chest feel lighter than it had in months. Later that night, after the restaurant quieted down, the waiter found the courage to approach Shaq again. His voice shook slightly, but his words were steady. "Mr. O'Neill," he began, "I want to thank you. That night, I was wrong. I judged you and I disrespected you. But instead of ending my career, you gave me a chance. You showed me what respect really means. I'll never forget that." Shaq listened quietly, then placed one massive hand on the young man's shoulder. His voice was deep but gentle. "Everybody makes mistakes," he said, "but not everyone learns from them. The fact that you stayed, that you worked, that you changed, that's what matters. The waiter's eyes watered. But this time it wasn't from shame. It was from gratitude. Respect, Shaq continued, isn't just about the job. It's about life. Carry it with you everywhere, not just here, because the world is full of people who will look down on others. Don't be one of them. The waiter nodded firmly. I won't. Not anymore. Word of the incident had already spread far beyond the restaurant's walls. The videos guests had recorded that night went viral within days, racking up millions of views across social media. People from around the world watched Shaq's calm, powerful response and shared their own stories of being judged unfairly or of learning the value of kindness. News outlets picked it up, calling it the night Shaq taught a lesson in respect. Comment sections flooded with admiration. This is why I love Shaq. Respect is free. What a line. That waiter just got the lesson of a lifetime. The restaurant itself became more popular than ever, not just for food, but for the story behind it. Guests came hoping to see Shaq, yes, but also because they wanted to eat in a place where respect was more than a word. It was a standard, and as for the waiter, his life was forever changed. He worked his way back up, but this time with humility. Every guest, no matter how they looked, was treated with the same warmth and dignity. People noticed a difference in him, and slowly, his reputation transformed from the arrogant server to the man who embodied the lesson that had once humbled him. Years later, when he looked back on that night, he didn't just see shame. He saw the turning point. The night that stripped away his pride and gave him something far greater, a lesson in humanity. Because Shaq had been right. Respect is free. It costs nothing to give, but it can change everything when you do. And that night in the restaurant proved it.